The Galactic Federation classified planets on a scale of 1 to 15. A Class 13 Deathworld was the kind of place no sane species willingly set foot on. It wasn't just hostile, it was an execution ground. Extreme weather, relentless predators, and an ecosystem designed to eradicate intruders. No colony had ever survived on one. No army had ever returned. And yet, the Federation believed their elite forces could change that. A battalion was assembled, highly trained, battle-hardened soldiers from across the galaxy. They came prepared for anything. Bioweapons, environmental hazards, even unknown predators. Their orders were simple: secure a landing zone, establish a foothold, and report back. Among them were humans. Newer to the galactic scene, physically weaker than most species, yet oddly persistent. The other races respected them but didn't expect much. Humanity had proven itself in past conflicts, but a Deathworld was something else entirely. No one had ever conquered one. The approach was smooth. The planet looked deceivingly normal, lush, green, almost Earth-like. Scanners picked up dense vegetation, unfamiliar fauna, and atmospheric conditions just within survival limits. But there were anomalies. Energy readings flickered, signals distorted. A minor interference, the commanders assumed. Nothing that would compromise the mission. Drop ships descended, unloading troops and equipment. A base was established within hours. Trenches dug, automated turrets placed, patrols deployed. The ground was solid, the air breathable. No immediate threats. A routine deployment so far. But something was wrong. The silence was unnatural. No wind rustling through the trees. No distant cries of wildlife. Just an oppressive stillness. A few soldiers commented on it, laughing it off as nerves. The Night Watch reported movement at the tree line, shadows shifting, shapes disappearing when lights passed over them. Drones were sent out. They didn't return. The commanding officers dismissed the reports. Just an unfamiliar ecosystem. Nothing to panic over. They had firepower, experience, technology. What could a planet possibly throw at them that they weren't prepared for? Then, morning came. And with it, the first missing soldiers. Their beds were empty. No signs of struggle, no alarms triggered. Their gear remained untouched. A few officers assumed desertion, others suspected an attack. Scanners were recalibrated. Patrols doubled. Still, no bodies. No tracks. No answers. By midday, the first screams echoed through the forest. The first bodies were found ripped open, yet not consumed. Their weapons still fully loaded. No enemy footprints. No traces of battle. Confusion turned to unease. Unease turned to fear. The sensors continued to fail. Communications flickered. Soldiers moved in groups, rifles raised, scanning every shadow. The once organized camp now felt like a cage. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the jungle around them came alive. And the war truly began. The first night had been silent. The second was filled with screams. They came from everywhere and nowhere. Voices of soldiers cut short, weapons discharged into the dark, then nothing. No alarms triggered. No movements detected. Just a growing list of names that would never respond to roll call again. Panic set in. The commanding officers tried to maintain order, but authority meant nothing when death came without warning. The base was shrinking, the perimeter pulled inward, every surviving soldier huddled together under the dim glow of failing floodlights. They fired at shadows, at whispers in the dark, at things that left no bodies behind. By morning, a third of the battalion was gone. The forest remained unchanged, untouched, as if it had never been disturbed. But now, the planet felt aware. The trees swayed without wind. The ground felt softer. The air was heavier, clinging to the skin like something alive. Drones were useless. Automated defenses refused to fire. Even the simplest tracking devices malfunctioned. Whatever hunted them didn't just kill, it erased. Footsteps vanished. Bloodstains dried within minutes. The dead couldn't even leave behind a warning. The second day should have brought relief. The sun was up, the unknown horrors retreating into the shadows. But then, the jungle moved. The ground shifted, swallowing trenches whole. Soldiers ran, but the paths they took didn't exist when they turned back. The air turned toxic in sudden bursts, melting exposed flesh before gas masks could seal. The water, once tested as safe, now corroded armor and skin alike. It wasn't just the creatures. The entire planet was the enemy. The remaining officers attempted an evacuation. Dropships were called. The signal was sent. No response. The fleet was still in orbit, but for all the soldiers knew, they were already dead. Desperation led to madness. Some ran into the forest, choosing to take their chances outside the base. None of them came back. Others turned on each other, blaming incompetence, cowardice, anything that might explain why they were dying. By nightfall, there were only a handful left. The jungle no longer watched. It closed in. And the last survivors finally understood. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a graveyard. And they had never stood a chance. By the third night, there was no more command, no more strategy. Just survival. The remaining soldiers clung to their weapons like lifelines, but deep down, they knew the truth. Firepower meant nothing here. The jungle had already won. They moved in silence, what little training still intact forcing them into small, cautious groups. But it didn't matter. The planet was patient. It picked them off one by one. A misstep, a breath too loud, an instant of hesitation, that was all it took. The last transmissions had gone out hours ago. No one answered. No reinforcements were coming. The fleet, if it was even still there, had already written them off. He didn't know when he became the last one left. There was no final battle, no heroic stand. Just the realization that no other voices responded when he whispered into his comm. Somehow, he was still breathing. Maybe the planet had underestimated him. Maybe it had never encountered something as stubborn as a human before. The others, the aliens, stronger, faster, more advanced, had all been wiped out. Yet he remained. The air burned his lungs, his armor was cracked, his body barely holding together. But he adapted. He learned. The jungle wasn't just alive, it was thinking. Studying him. Testing him. He stopped running. He started fighting back. The planet had taken everything, but it had given something in return, an understanding of how it worked. He set traps, using its own terrain against it. Moved unpredictably, forcing it to react instead of control. Every step forward was an act of defiance. Every breath a victory. The wreckage of the dropships was scattered across the jungle, torn apart, half buried in the shifting earth. But the scraps were enough. He salvaged what he could, rewired what little tech hadn't been corrupted. A beacon, a single distress signal, was all he needed. The jungle felt it. Knew what he was trying to do. It came at him with everything. The ground collapsed beneath him, the trees twisted like living things, the air itself turned against him. Every step was a battle, every second a fight. But he had already lost everything. He had nothing left to fear. By the time he activated the beacon, he was barely standing. His armor was shattered, his vision blurred. The jungle loomed around him, waiting for him to fall. But he didn't. And as the signal pulsed into the sky, he smiled. Because now, for the first time, the planet had something to fear too. When they found him, he was barely alive. His armor was in ruins, his body broken, but his hands were still clenched into fists. He had survived longer than an entire battalion of the galaxy's finest. That alone terrified them. The debriefing was brutal. The officers demanded answers. How did the entire force vanish without a trace? How did one man endure what wiped out an army? They treated him with suspicion, as if survival itself was a crime. He told them everything. The jungle wasn't just dangerous, it was aware. It didn't attack like an animal or a swarm. It hunted like a strategist, adapting, countering, learning. It didn't just kill. It erased. They didn't believe him. His reports were labeled as trauma-induced hallucinations. The official story would be equipment failure, unforeseen environmental hazards, tragic miscalculation. The Federation would classify the planet as off-limits, but that was just protocol. They wouldn't truly understand. But he did. The planet hadn't just tried to kill him. It had tried to erase him. And it had failed. That meant something. No one spoke of it openly, but he could see it in their eyes. The officers, the scientists, the soldiers who escorted him, they weren't looking at a man. They were looking at something unnatural. Something that shouldn't have made it back. The fear in their faces was the same fear he had seen in the jungle. The Deathworld had let nothing escape before. Until now. And he knew one day, humanity would return. Not as invaders. Not as prey. But as something the planet would finally learn to fear.